Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. This is what's been going on in China in the past 24 hours. At the World Artificial Intelligence Conference in Shanghai on Friday, Xi presented China as a leader in global AI governance, calling for countries to work together to create what he described as a fair and reasonable international system for artificial intelligence. The headline here is not just about technology, it is about power. China is attempting to build an AI ecosystem where countries, especially developing nations, rely on Chinese technology, training, infrastructure, and standards. Beijing announced the creation of the World Artificial Intelligence Cooperation Organization, which now includes 29 countries, and Xi pledged thousands of AI training opportunities and new cooperation centers across regions, including Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. This is a very familiar Chinese strategy. Combine economic development, technology transfer, and diplomatic engagement into one package. We have seen versions of this playbook with infrastructure through the Belt and Road Initiative, telecommunications through companies like Huawei, and now Beijing is bringing that same approach into AI. The competition over AI is increasingly becoming a competition over who gets to define the future rules. Washington has been building partnerships around secure technology supply chains and responsible AI development. Beijing is offering a different model, one centered around open source systems, accessibility, and a larger role for governments in shaping how AI is used. She also leaned heavily into AI safety, calling for safeguards, monitoring systems, and ways to prevent artificial intelligence from operating beyond human control. The interesting part is that China is presenting itself as both the champion of AI openness and the guardian against AI risks, even as Beijing continues tightening control over technology inside China. This technology competition is happening as U.S.-China relations face new political turbulence. President Trump's accusations that China interfered in the 2020 U.S. election have reopened one of the most sensitive issues between Washington and Beijing. Trump claimed China acquired hundreds of millions of American voter records and described it as a historic election security breach. The intelligence documents released alongside those claims paint a more complicated picture. U.S. officials assessed that China had explored influence activities, including online operations, messaging efforts, and attempts to gather information that could damage political figures. But those assessments did not conclude that Beijing changed votes, manipulated ballot systems, or altered the outcome of the election. That distinction matters because foreign influence operations are a real threat. China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea all have cyber capabilities and intelligence services that seek information and opportunities to influence events. But collecting data and successfully changing an election are two very different things. The immediate concern in Washington and Beijing is whether this issue disrupts the fragile effort to stabilize relations. Just weeks ago, Trump and Xi were trying to maintain a more constructive relationship after their May meeting, with a possible Xi visit to Washington planned for September. Beijing's response has been forceful, calling the accusations fabricated and warning against what it sees as an attempt to damage China's reputation. But both governments have experience separating public confrontation from private negotiations. The bigger question is whether election interference becomes another permanent battlefield in the broader U.S.-China competition, alongside trade, technology restrictions, cyber operations, and Taiwan. Speaking of Taiwan, Beijing continues to apply pressure across multiple fronts. Taiwan is facing increasing diplomatic isolation after Papua New Guinea announced it would close Taiwan's representative office. Taiwan Vice President Xiao Bi-Kim said China is suppressing Taiwan's international space and limiting its ability to build relationships abroad. That effort is part of a longer Chinese campaign. Beijing has spent years persuading countries to cut formal ties with Taipei by emphasizing economic relationships with China and warning against official engagement with Taiwan. Only 12 countries now maintain formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan, but Taipei is trying to offset that vulnerability by strengthening unofficial partnerships and expanding its defense capabilities. President Lai Ching-te is pushing for additional investment in drones, surveillance systems, coastal defense capabilities, and unmanned maritime platforms. Taiwan is seeking a new defense package worth approximately $210 billion through 2031, focused heavily on these systems. And drones have become one of the defining security issues of this era. The wars in Ukraine and the Middle East have demonstrated that relatively inexpensive unmanned systems can create serious problems for much larger militaries. For Taiwan, the goal is not trying to match China ship for ship or aircraft for aircraft. The goal is creating enough uncertainty and resilience that Beijing would face greater costs in any potential conflict. China sees these developments very differently. Beijing argues that expanded U.S.-Taiwan defense cooperation is destabilizing and that additional drone infrastructure would create vulnerabilities rather than security. Meanwhile, military pressure around Taiwan continues at a steady pace. Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense reported Chinese aircraft and naval vessels operating around the island between July 16th and July 17th, including 9 aircraft sorties and 7 Chinese warships. The significance is less about one individual day of activity and more about the pattern. Beijing continues normalizing military operations around Taiwan, maintaining pressure without necessarily creating an immediate crisis. China is also pushing back against Western governments over economic security issues. Beijing criticized Britain's decision to nationalize British steel, which had been owned by Chinese company Jingyi Group. The UK government argued the move was necessary to protect a critical industrial capability and preserve domestic steel production. China responded that the decision harmed Chinese business interests and damaged investor confidence. The dispute reflects a larger global debate over strategic industries. Steel, semiconductors, artificial intelligence, energy, and critical minerals are increasingly being viewed not just as economic sectors, but as national security assets. The same tension is visible in China's response to new U.S. visa restrictions. The U.S. government announced tighter rules for foreign students, exchange visitors, and journalists, including limiting Chinese journalist visas to 90 days. Beijing called the move discriminatory and warned it could take reciprocal action. This continues a broader trend where areas once considered normal exchanges, like education, media, and research, are increasingly viewed through a national security lens by both Washington and Beijing. Finally, China is becoming more aggressive in its information campaigns against regional rivals. Beijing faced criticism after China Daily released an AI-generated video portraying the Philippines as a frightened monkey being pushed into confrontation with China by the US and Japan over the South China Sea. Manila condemned the video as racist and dehumanizing propaganda. The timing is notable because tensions between China and the Philippines continue to rise around disputed areas, including Scarborough Shoal and the Spratly Islands. Chinese Coast Guard vessels have used water cannons against Philippine ships, and both sides continue accusing the other of provoking confrontations. Thanks for listening. Keep your maps open, your sources skeptical, and your notifications on. For the written brief, find us at restrictedhandling.substack.com. See you tomorrow.